In this question, we're given the joint PMF of two discrete random variables, and you want to answer some probability questions using the joint PMF. So the first thing that you want to do is let's write the joint PMF in table form. When you want to write it in table form, here we'll note the values that x takes are 0 and 1, right? So when I draw it in table form, so I know. So let's just make it over here. So the values that x takes are 0 and 1, and the values that y takes are 1 and 2 and 3, right? So when you're writing it in table form, we write the values of x 0, 1 and values of y 1, 2, 3. And we know the probability that x is 0 and y is 1 is 0.18. So we'll write this over here. And then the probability x is 0 and y is 2 is 0.13. The probability x is 0 and y is 3 is 0.11. The probability x is 1 and y is 1 is 0.16. The probability x is 1, y is 2 is 0.11. Probability x is 1 and y is 3 is 0.31. So right now, we've just written our joint PMF in the form of a table. Now we need to recall something in order to answer these probability questions. Recall to find any probability concerning x and y from the joint PMF of x and y. We can sum up the joint PMF over those values of x and y. Right, so whenever we want to answer any probability question using the joint PMF of x and y, we can just sum up the joint PMF over those values of x and y. So the first part asks us to find probability x is 0 and y is less than 3. Now, so the idea is that to find probability x is 0 and y is less than 3. Right, so we will sum up the joint PMF over those values where x is 0 and y is less than 3, right? So if you want to find the probability that x is 0, now this is x is 0, right? This is x is equal to 0. Let me just write it more clearly. I'm sorry. So this was 0. So this is x is 0 and y is less than 3. Y is less than 3 is this, right? So to find the probability that x is 0 and y is less than 3, we'll sum up the joint PMF over those values where x is 0 and y is less than 3, which are these values, right? So just summing up the joint PMF over those values, which is 0.18 plus 0.13 is equal to 0.31. So this is how we've done the first part. Now let's move on to the second part. For that, let's just erase this. Sorry. Right, let's just quickly rewrite this and let's erase this and let's do the second part. The second part is actually a conditional probability y is 2 given x is 0. Since it's a conditional probability, we'll first apply the definition of conditional probability. So probability y is 2 given x is 0. So if we apply the definition of conditional probability, this is probability y is 2 and x is 0 divided by probability x is 0. So here we just applied the definition of conditional probability, right, which is probability of A given B. If we just quickly write a definition of conditional probability, which is the probability of A given B is probability of A and B divided by probability of B. Right now, this can be directly read from joint PMF of x and y. So we can directly read this from the joint PMF because joint PMF gives us probabilities in the form that, the probability that x takes the value x and y takes the value. So this can be directly read. The numerator can be directly read from the joint PMF of x and y. Right, so this we can directly read from the joint PMF of x and y. Let's just first read it and then we'll move forward. So we know we want to find the probability that y is 2 and x is 0, right? So it's this probability, right? Because remember the joint PMF is giving us probabilities in the form that probability x is x and y is y, right? So here we want to find the probability y is 2 and x is 0. So any probability in the form that x is x and y is y can just be directly read from the joint PMF, right? So now let's look at the second one. Probability x is 0. Now to find, like we said, to find any probability concerning x and y from the joint PMF of x and y, we just sum up the joint PMF over those values of x and y. To find probability x is equal to 0, what we'll do is sum up the joint PMF over all those values where x is 0, regardless of what y is. Regardless of what y is. So we're going to sum up the joint PMF over those values where x is 0, regardless of whatever y is, right? So this is like, if we recall, so this is where x is, this is where x is 0. So sum of the joint PMF for all those values where x is 0, regardless of what y is. So this is basically this, right? So then we can find this probability as probability x is equal to 0 would be 0.18 plus 0.13 plus 0.11, right? Probability y is 2 and x is 0 can be directly read from the joint PMF because the joint PMF gives us probabilities in the form probability x is x and y is y. Our probability x is 0, you'll just sum up the joint PMF over all those values where x is 0, regardless of what y is. There's no condition imposed on y. So we just sum up 0.18, 0.13, and 0.11, right? And this just turns out to be 0.3095. Now we'll do part C. And let's just erase this out. Now part C is probability y is less than x. Let's just erase this, clean this up. Right. So now part C is this was 0. Part C is probability y is less than x. So again, like we said, to find any probability concerning x and y from the joint PMF of x and y, we just sum up the joint PMF over those values of x and y. Now to find probability y is less than x, sum up the joint PMF over all those values where y is less than x. We just sum it up. Now what you will notice over here is y is less than x. There's no such value in the joint PMF where y is less than x because when y is 1, x is 0. So x is less than y. Here, wherever x is 0, x is less than y. And here, x and y are equal, but y is not less than x. And here, y is greater than x, right? So in these three, x is less than y. Here, x is equal to y. And here also, x is less than y, right? So there's no such value in the joint PMF where y is less than x. So this probability that y is less than x is 0, right? We don't have any value, no such value in joint PMF. No such value in joint PMF where y is less than x, right? So just remember that whenever we are finding any probability using a joint PMF of x and y, we just need to sum up the joint PMF over those values of x and y.